Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Geo Talks. My name is Angelica Haggart, and I'm the digital editor for Canadian Geographic. I'd first like to acknowledge that our offices are located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples, who have been the guardians of and in relationship with these lands for thousands of years. We further acknowledge and recognize that our work reaches across all the distinct First Nations, Métis homelands, and Inuit Nunangat, and for this, we are grateful. Before I turn it over to this evening's guest, I wanted to note that the Royal Canadian Geographical Society is a non-profit organization, and we'd be grateful if you'd consider making a donation to support our efforts, which includes events like these. I'm delighted today to be joined by author J.B. MacKinnon to talk about rewilding, the idea of restoring land to its natural, uncultivated state. It's used especially with reference to the reintroduction of species that have been driven out or extirpated. James is an award-winning environment, nature, and outdoors journalist whose work has appeared in The New Yorker, National Geographic, and The Atlantic. His latest book, The Day the World Stopped Shopping, will be published in May. But in 2014, he penned The Once and Future World, which explored the topic of rewilding. James has kindly agreed to answer some questions following his presentation, so please share your questions in the chat or comment boxes from wherever you're watching during the talk. And now, James, over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Angelica, and thanks to Canadian Geographic for having me out for this event tonight. Among other things, it gave me a reason to shave my face, to get rid of all that patchy growth. I was, I guess, in the process of rewilding my face, and in this case, I'm feeling pretty good to be a little more tamed for the moment. Today, I'm going to be talking about rewilding and some of the main ideas that drive the concept of rewilding. And there'll be some slides, so you won't have to look at my face for at least a portion of the evening. And after that, we'll go back to, I'll do a short reading actually from the book, and then we'll come back and do some more face-to-face in terms of answering any questions that you might have. I think it's in the questions really that we'll get into the nitty-gritty of rewilding. As I say, the talk itself is really going to be more about some of these main concepts that surround the idea of rewilding and where it emerged from. So I'm just going to bring up the first, get the slides going here. Okay. And I wanted to start by telling you about how I ended up thinking and writing about rewilding in the first place. And the story of that begins where I grew up. So I grew up in the semi-arid landscape around Kamloops, BC, and I was lucky enough to grow up in this house where I could just walk out the back door and out onto grasslands that I could explore pretty much as far as my legs would carry me. And I was always on the lookout for wildlife, of course. And the biggest, baddest animal that I might see out there was the one that ended up on the cover of my book, the red fox. That was the biggest, baddest animal out there in the landscape, and the one that I was always really excited about seeing. And of course, I did what a lot of people do. I eventually moved away from home and went back to visit, less and less often. And on one of those trips, I came back and discovered that that portion of grasslands that I used to love so much as a child had been bulldozed and built over with a suburb. I'm sure a lot of you out there have had an experience like that yourselves. So obviously, the foxes that had lived there were gone. And this got me thinking about how the losses might accumulate as we slowly eat up portions of the landscape with development. And I started wondering, well, does this mean that in the past there were many, many more foxes than there are today, and we've been whittling down that population as the grasslands were developed? So I started to look into that question, and I started reading old explorers' journals and naturalists' diaries and things like this from the early days of settlement in the Kamloops area. And one of the first things I learned was that foxes which are kind of the symbol of the wild for me in my youth, were not even a native species on the landscape. Foxes are probably not native to most of North America. In fact, they were introduced either through fur farm escapes or in some cases from British fox hunters who imported foxes to hunt them in different parts of the continent. And so that was startling to me that the fox, my personal symbol of the wild, was not even a native species. But what struck me even more was that there were all kinds of other animals that had disappeared from the landscape. There used to be elk and caribou and wolves, maybe even bison and pronghorn antelope up in the interior grasslands of British Columbia. But most surprisingly to me was the fact that in the past, if in the past the red fox was the big bad animal I might bump into, in the deeper past, it would have been this guy here, the grizzly bear. So it was pretty clear to me at that point that I had grown up on a landscape that had lost a lot of its wild qualities. And, I might have had quite a different childhood if I had grown up with all of the species present that had existed there in the past. I would have been more like being a child growing up in Canmore or Banff than in the community I grew up in. But what I thought was even more fascinating was that not only was all of this wildlife gone, but it seemed to be almost totally forgotten. No one talked about these other species being missing as I was growing up. I never learned about them in school, certainly. And so this is the first rule of rewilding. To know what is, you must know what was. We need to know what nature was like in the past in order to have a sense of what we're looking at when we look at nature in the present, and to know what our options are for what nature might look like in the future. So I started looking into this question in locations around the world, and this is a painting from, it's called The Fish Market. It was done by an artist named Frans Snyders in 1620, and it's from the Netherlands. And what this painting shows is all the different creatures that were being commercially fished in the Wadden Sea, which is a shallow sea offshore of Netherlands at that time. So back in 1620, all of these different species were being commercially fished. The only I've got my laser pointer here. The only exception is this turtle down here, which apparently is a species that was being imported for food into the Wadden at that time. So today, you've got this tremendous abundance in this picture. Today, not one of those species is still commercially fished in the Wadden Sea. 90% of the major species in the Wadden Sea are now considered to be depleted, and 20% of them are no longer found in the Wadden Sea at all. That's 1 in 5 species. 1 in 5 of the major species in the Wadden no longer found there at all. And yet, if we were standing on the shores of the Wadden Sea, none of this would be visible to us. It would still look like a wild place. And in fact, the Wadden is a national park today. One of the things I did as I was working on the book was ask one of the world's leading experts in this kind of ecological transformation, how much of the planet has undergone transformations similar to the ones that we see in through this painting of the Wadden Sea or on the landscape that I grew up in. His answer was that these kinds of transformations have happened on 90% of the globe. So in other words, there are opportunities for rewilding almost everywhere on Earth. So how do we forget what the natural world used to look like? By now, I think many of you will have heard of shifting baseline syndrome. And that is, as we grow up, we look around ourselves and we determine that the natural world that surrounds us is the normal state of nature. That becomes the baseline against which we measure any degradation to the natural environment in our lifetimes. But then along comes the next generation, and they do the same thing. So what has become a degraded state of nature to one generation becomes the normal state of nature for the next generation. And on it goes, generation after generation. With every generation, the baseline shifts. Now, one of the first great studies that proved shifting baseline syndrome is still, in my opinion, one of the best illustrations of it. And it was done in the Florida Keys, which is that string of islands stretching out from the southern tip of Florida, made famous by Ernest Hemingway in some of his writing. And it turns out that there was a fishing charter company in the Florida Keys that had been taking photos of its clients for more than 50 years. So here's a photo from 1958. You can see, it looks like the cast of Gilligan's Island standing in front of fish that are nearly as large as the fishers themselves. Now here's one from 1980. And here's 2007. So these spot the changes puzzles that you sometimes see in magazines where there's a picture and there's two pictures that look almost exactly the same, and you have to spot the 5 differences between the two that are hidden in one of the photos. I mean, these kinds of images are sort of the opposite of that, right? I mean, the changes leap out at you across time. The fish in the past were larger. The numbers of fish that were being caught were much higher. That alone, however, is not shifting baseline syndrome. That's just ordinary degradation and depletion of the natural world. What makes it a shifting baseline syndrome is what the woman who did this study explained to me. So this is a woman named Lauren McClenachan, a marine biologist, and she said that when she took these photos around to fishermen, many of them would simply refuse to believe that there used to be more fish in the sea. And she points out that in the photos, even as these dramatic changes happen in the number of fish being caught and the size of the fish being caught, the smiles of pride on the fishermen's faces remain the same. Their delight in their catch is unchanged. So another name for shifting baseline syndrome is environmental amnesia. There's 2 ways we can look at this kind of information. On the one hand, there's a sense of loss. On the other hand, once we know what nature was like in the past, we can use that knowledge to set a higher bar for what nature might be like in the future. And this brings us to this idea of rewilding. There's a few definitions of that word floating around, but to me, rewilding is the process of bringing back wild qualities to places where they've been lost. And rewilding is not the same as traditional conservation. Traditional conservation has focused on protecting nature, saving the last best wild places, protecting endangered species from extinction. And conservation, obviously, has been incredibly important. But it's also had one unfortunate effect, and that is to create this sense of separation between humans and nature. Nature goes into protected areas, over here, and humans get to use everything else for our activities. The most ambitious conservation targets agreed on by the international community to date aim to set aside about 12% of the land and sea on the planet in protected areas. That leaves 88% of the planet to human uses. So if we want to live in a world that's ecologically whole in any real way, or if we want to live in a world that begins in any way to reflect the natural abundance of the past, then we have to do much more than just set aside natural areas in parks and protected areas. We need to start rebuilding nature everywhere. And to me, That's the work of rewilding. Now, in many cases, even places that we think of as being about as wild as can be rewilded. Even places like Banff National Park, for example, or Yellowstone National Park in the US are missing major species. So when I was working on this book, I spent some time in Banff, and one afternoon I went out and I ate a bison burger in the bison restaurant in the bison courtyard, which is just off Buffalo Street. But at the time, there hadn't been wild bison in Banff for more than 100 years. And a lot of Canadians were not aware that bison had ever been present in the park. Now, since then, the campaign to bring bison back to the Rockies has been, one of the great rewilding successes that we have, not only in Canada, but in the world. But it also shows how important that social side of it is, right? If we bring back the memory of a species, it can bring back the species itself. So in 2018, Parks Canada released 31 bison into the park, and this photo shows them being released just after they were helicoptered into the area that they are living in. And just about a week ago, 6 more bison were reintroduced into Waterton National Park. And it's just incredible to see these animals out in that big mountain landscape, when I think a lot of us have always pictured bison as being only an animal of the plains and the plains and the boreal forests. Now, of course, rewilding is, as I said, something that we also need to try to build in to all kinds of areas of human activity. And it's interesting to note that often animals are more willing to live with us than we are willing to live with them. So this is a couple of bighorn sheep in a wild moment, 2 rams about to clash heads. And they're part of a herd that moved onto artificial cliffs that were created by 2 mines in Alberta. And I remember reading one article about this project, or not a project, about this herd of bison. And the writer was wondering aloud if we should even call animals like this wild, because they don't live in a strictly, wild-looking setting. I certainly think of them as wild animals. They are animals who have rewilded themselves. In this case, the bighorn were actually using us. They seem to find it not too difficult to adapt to the scheduled operations of the mine. And they benefited from the fact that the general public and hunters and so on had limited access to the mine. On top of that, in this case, the mine's managers decided not to drive the bighorn away, and in fact started to reseed some of the reclaimed areas of the mine with natural grasses and things like this to help support the herd. That herd ended up being one of the healthiest in the Rockies and was actually used to provide seed animals for bighorn rewilding in parts of the United States that have lost their bighorn. And those rewildings, it's interesting to me, they're often launched with these big welcome home celebrations by the local residents. It's a really good reminder that we often don't appreciate the presence of species until they're gone. I think some of the most fascinating rewilding projects will happen in cities. And to give you just one quick example of the potential, this is a project called The Animal Wall by an artist named Gitta Geschwendner. And the goal here was to match 1,000 housing units for people that were being constructed in Cardiff Bay, Wales, with 1,000 housing units for birds and bats. And projects like this help remind us that when we generally design cities, towns, highways, farms, mines, all of these things that we build, we generally design and construct them with only one species in mind: human beings. But with a little creativity, we can design the places we live to accommodate other species as well, as we see with the animal wall. Now, you'll often hear people talk about reconnecting with nature as something we ought to do. It's, I think it's often thought of in line with things like eating less meat or donating blood. Something we ought to do, but it's not necessarily something we should feel urgently that we should feel is urgently necessary. Often, I think we treat our disconnection with nature as something like a minor embarrassment, and you can see that in this SUV ad I clipped a few years ago. For those of you who might be watching this on their phones, this is the top half of an advertisement. It helps us identify the birds of North America, and some of the common species it identifies are the whatchamacallit, the blue-winged thingamabob, and the what's its name. So this was an advertisement for SUVs, and I suppose the intention of the SUV manufacturer was that we see the purchase of an SUV as the best way to reconnect with nature. But I'm not totally convinced that's the solution we're really looking for. Reconnection to nature, however, really might be critically important to making a wilder world. And one of the best places I found to explore that was in Hawaii. And what's interesting about the history of Hawaii is that there was a period of several hundred years where Native Hawaiians were living with no contact with the outside world at all. If they destroyed their environment, then they would die, plain and simple. And in a way, that made their situation a microcosm of what we're experiencing on a planetary scale today. They were this group of small cluster of islands surrounded by what must have seemed to them as an almost infinite ocean. And we, of course, are a small planet adrift in outer space. Now, Hawaii's history can be summed up pretty neatly in this graph. I will get my laser pointer going again here. So this is a graph that shows the degree of depletion or degradation in coral reefs in the Hawaiian Islands over centuries, across centuries. And so if we start up here, this is the point at which the reefs had 0% depletion or degradation. And this is the point at which the first human beings arrived in Hawaii. And they immediately begin to deplete the reefs. So they're exploiting the reefs. And in fact, on the land, they appear to have driven some species entirely extinct. So that happens over a couple of hundred years. But then the tailspin ends. And for several more hundreds of years, the coral reef productivity remains stable. And in fact, the degree of depletion and degradation actually improves. The reefs are being restored, or as we might say, rewilded to some extent. And all through this period, the human population of Hawaii is actually growing. So they have, they're rewilding their landscape, and their population is growing. Their seascape in this case. This point, as you might guess, is the point at which European explorers and settlers make contact with Hawaii, and they do two things. One is they disrupt that relationship that had developed between Native Hawaiian culture and their land and seascape, and of course they start to exploit the resources of Hawaii for themselves as well. So there's a long, long decline into depletion and degradation. And really, the only positive news along that line comes right here in the 1940s. And there again, you see the sudden jump up in the productivity, the biological productivity of the reefs. And that is because the reefs were made off limits during World War II. But it's this long period of stability here that's most interesting. Centuries where the culture in the Native Hawaiian Island or in the Hawaiian Islands appears to have developed a really strong appreciation for nature to the point that they were able to reverse some of the past depletion and degradation. So how did Hawaiians develop their sustainable society? I mean, no one really knows that, but the best guess seems to be that because they lived on such a limited landscape, any errors they made in environmental stewardship kick back on them pretty quickly and maybe pretty hard. One thing we do know is that Native Hawaiian culture developed this deep appreciation for biological diversity. So they came to understand that maintaining the health of entire ecosystems was really important to their own survival. At an individual level, that meant that Native Hawaiians developed strong social relationships with the natural world. And when I first encountered this idea of social relationships to the natural world, it sounded kind of woo-woo to me. But I came to understand it a little bit better through this guy. And this is a young man named Mokuboy Pu'ule Chandler. And his family has a traditional responsibility for that plant that he's standing with. And this is a plant that in the Hawaiian forest is so unremarkable that it was never given a name in English by colonists or explorers. In Hawaiian, the plant's called Papala, and historically it was gathered, dried, and it was carried to the top of a peak called MacKinnon on the island of Kauai. And there, Papala is very light, it's a very lightweight wood, and it's hollow, so it catches very easily in the wind. So men from Mokuboy Pu'ule Chandler's family would carry the Papala up, set it on fire, and then cast it into the sea wind that rushed up the face of the mountain. And in 2012, they revived this traditional fireworks ceremony, and you can see that here. This is what it looked like. When they revived the fireworks ceremony, though, there was one big difference from the way it was carried out in the past, and that is they didn't use Papala. They had to use a different plant because since European arrival on the islands, Papala has become an endangered species. So this shows how important a social relationship with nature can be. If the European culture hadn't disrupted Native Hawaiian culture so deeply, then Papala would probably never have become endangered because it always would have had this constituency of people defending its interests. And as that social relationship has been revived, Papala has been revived as well. The plant's being revived on the landscape. Mokuboy and his father have been, two of the people who've been involved in replanting Papala in a national park in Kauai. So when we talk about rewilding, we usually talk about rewilding land and seascapes, but we can also talk about rewilding ourselves. And I think we need to start asking, what social relationships do we have with nature? Which ones, have we still maintained into the present day? How can we deepen them? How can we build more of them? Now, when I wrote the Once and Future World, the idea of rewilding was still fairly new to a lot of people. Since then, there's been a lot of progress, but probably the most striking event has been the pandemic. It's given us all a chance to see how, when we release the pressure of human activity, other species come rushing back. And I'm sure all of you have your favorite examples of these examples of the wild, coming back, or wild animals showing up where they hadn't been for a long time. Two of my favorites were American crocodiles that retook a beach. I think it was in the Yucatan in Mexico. So they had been pushed out into mangrove swamps around this beach area that had become popular with tourists. And when they vanished, the crocodiles came out and were actually seen, basking on the beach and literally surfing in the waves. Another of my favorites was Asian elephants reclaiming an old traditional, for them, travel route that they had abandoned because the human density around that area had become too high. And there's this wonderful short video of these elephants, retracing this ancestral path. And one of them actually stops and climbs up the stairs of a little temple and kind of checks that out with curiosity. Now, as it happens, I wrote about a similar kind of experience in the Once and Future world. As part of writing the book, I did this series of personal experiments in reconnection with nature. And I wanted to do a reading about the last one of those that I did. So give me a moment to find the page. And here we go. In a final kind of experiment, I spent a month taking daily swims in the ocean. It's odd that I'd never done something similar before. For 20 years, I've never lived more than a half-hour's walk from salt water, yet I sometimes go weeks without truly noticing the Pacific. But the beach where I swam every day was far from home. It happened to be the point where the Guadalquivir River spills into the Atlantic Ocean in southwestern Spain. The shore there was a perfect illustration of where the human relationship to the sea has taken us. Other than crowds of people sunning themselves, there was not a lot of life. After 2 weeks of afternoon swims, I had seen precisely 0 fish of any size. I explained this away with the fact that the water was silty and the color of caramel, but the birds too passed by, mainly in the distance, and even seashells amounted to just a scattering on the sand. We retain the myth of the sea as boundless, so large and powerful that we are like specks at its edge. Man marks the earth with ruin. His control stops at the sea, as Lord Byron wrote. Modern ecologists argue that this persistent belief is a delusion that blinds people to a worldwide crisis in the oceans. I'd heard those scientists' words, but had never acknowledged their meaning until I made those daily visits to the shore. Looking down the beach at the tide of humanity in their bright swimsuits, I had a sad epiphany. The wild ocean has been tamed. Then one afternoon, I descended the cobbled streets to the now familiar seaside and found that it was no longer familiar. A full moon tide had washed in and rearranged the beach. The whole bay, in fact, had taken on a different aspect, a new pattern of sandbars and pools. The sea had gently, beneath a clear sky and light breeze, moved the land around with the force of an aerial bombing run. The sea was on a new path. It trembled with chop. El Poniente, the west wind, steepened the faces of the waves. The tourists began to retreat. When a school holiday ended, the beach turned nearly empty overnight. The next day, the very next day, I waded into the water and was startled by a shoal of silver fish. How did the fish know? How did they know to return at exactly this time, their schedule precisely tuned to our own? After that, the ocean came steadily back to life. More little fish appeared, and bigger fish to chase the small ones. Shells washed onto the beach. Tiny shorebirds arrived, running back and forth at the edge of the water as if afraid to get their feet wet. And then gulls. How strange to realize that even gulls had been a rare sight until then. A tall white egret appeared, and then the rare Spanish imperial eagle. The beach bars folded their tents, and at last I was the only swimmer left. The old men and women still dotted the shore, studying the sea as if it was the only thing on earth worth thinking about. And on the day before I left, I took one final swim, just as a way of saying farewell. I was wading ashore, already feeling nostalgic, when some creature lashed out from the sand, stung my ankle, zigzagged off into the murk. Nature may not be what it was, no, but it isn't gone. It's waiting. Thanks, everyone, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much for that, James. We have lots of questions coming in the comments. Keep them coming, guys. We'll ask as many as we can while we keep James here. Luckily, he's on the West Coast, so it's not quite as late at night for him as it is for me here in Ottawa. A couple questions here, James, from some people watching on YouTube, Beej and Owen. Thank you for your questions. Would you consider removing invasive species part of rewilding?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think removing invasive species is a really complicated topic, actually. But I think in cases where the removal of invasive species encourages either the return of natural abundance to something like what has been known in the past, or makes way for improves conditions and habitat for native species, then I do consider it part of rewilding.
When you look at rewilding, say a wetland forest surrounded by residential, Deborah on YouTube here is wondering, how do you rewild or reforest in a situation like that where you're surrounded by residential lands?
Well, I think sometimes you can only do small things. You certainly, you can't be bringing wolverines into downtown Vancouver. I mean, we know there's limits, but even within spaces like that, there are possibilities. For example, I've heard ideas around things like, taking, if the trees form a canopy that's of use to birds and insects, flying insects, then perhaps you can build corridors out on the roofs of nearby buildings that expand the capacity of those things to nest or survive or feed or those sorts of things. There's a really wonderful map that I saw developed by a local biologist in Vancouver that showed how parks that, old parks had species like native squirrels and tree frogs and things like that. And new parks often lacked these species. And the reason was that the new parks were often created out of, say, industrial areas and things like that. So when they were created, there was no way for tree frogs and native squirrels in existing parks to access the new parks. So there was this possibility of kind of carrying species from islands of green where they exist to these islands of green where they weren't present because of the history of the location. So there's often opportunities like that can really enrich, not only opportunities for other species, but bring back the sound in that case of tree frogs, for example, to neighborhoods that would never otherwise hear them.
Now, in Canada, this is a question here from Ole, I apologize if I'm saying your name wrong, watching on YouTube, wondering about farmlands. Obviously, so much of Canada is farmlands, and is there any opportunity there to even partially rewild them?
Yeah, I mean, farmlands could absolutely be rewilded. I think mainly, though, it would involve removing some portion of the land that is currently under farming. I mean, right now we farm right to the absolute edges of acreage in farms in a lot of cases. Often, historically, there were things like hedgerows and windrows of trees that made up a portion of that landscape, and those things could be brought back. And those kinds of corridors can be, corridors that allow the travel of species from one place to another, even if they're narrow, those things can make quite a difference. The other thing, of course, is in practices like, how much pesticide or toxic chemicals are used in farming, because those affect the quality of habitat for all of the aquatic species that water runs into, and so that's another area where improvements can support rewilding in rivers, streams, marshes, all of those sorts of things. Another one, of course, is just simply our tolerances. So I mean, this is not farmland strictly speaking, although some of it is, but it's been quite extraordinary to watch in southwestern Alberta how grizzly bears are managing to move back out onto the landscape and are being accepted to some extent by farmers and ranchers in that area as a species that has some right to live where it formerly lived. I think the Canadian experience there is quite fascinating because, I mean, if we look at south of the border, there's been a lot of intolerance to the idea of grizzly bears moving anywhere outside of protected areas. But there seems to be a little more openness in Canada to the idea that if grizzly bears used to roam across the prairies, which they did all the way out to eastern Saskatchewan, I think there's more openness in Canada to the idea that perhaps they have a place there.
Here's a question from Mitch on YouTube. What is the argument to rewild beyond the intrinsic value of nature? So what he says is the ought to change argument. And to what extent are there then implications for carbon sequestration?
I mean, I think, first off, I guess I'd want to say that I think the ought to be there is pretty important. I think there's tremendous opportunities that we have as people to take pleasure in the presence of the natural world. I mean, to give just one example, there's a creek in Vancouver called Still Creek that people have been working to restore over quite a number of years now, and salmon have returned and are swimming right up into the heart of a pretty industrial portion of Vancouver. So, if you look at this from Google, if you look at it in Google Maps or Google Earth, it really looks like gray urbanity and concrete with this little sliver of a stream, and salmon are coming up into that place. Now, the reason I bring this one up is because I went down there a few years ago, and I mean, there were hundreds of people coming down to watch about a dozen salmon swim up this little creek. I mean, you'd hear all different languages, people of all ages, all walks of life. I mean, it brings a lot to our lives to have these species living among us. I think that's, we shouldn't understate the value of the magical quality of it. The other is that we just build a much more resilient, we build resilience for other species and for ourselves when we strengthen and create healthy landscapes. I mean, there's so many examples. Bringing back mangrove swamps can help, mangrove swamps, or bringing back eelgrass marshes, things like this. They can really help us with situations like the increasing number and power of storms. They can help us with sea level rise, help shelter us from sea level rise. And carbon sequestration is, that's a really good question. I mean, it's not an issue I've looked at in the last couple of years, but as things stood when I wrote the book, there were strong hints that if you really increase the productivity of the natural world, then that in itself sequesters nature, or sequesters carbon. If you think of the fact that there were, for example, maybe 10 to 100 times more whales out there, whales are built of carbon. If we have this tremendous abundance and this ramping up of the primary productivity of the natural world, then there are indications that might that in itself may act as a means of sequestering carbon and generating ecological responses that sequester carbon. But I have to admit, I'm not absolutely up to date on where the science has gone on that.
You mentioned Mangrove Forest. I just wanted to throw everybody to cangeo.ca. We do have a recent story up about the mangroves, so go take a look at that. Another question here from Jamie on Facebook. You've mentioned a few examples, but which cities are leading the way on rewilding that we can look to for possibilities in the future?
Leading the way. I'm not sure that I would be able to point to a leader. There's a lot of interest. There's a big set of interesting ideas out there. Daylighting streams, for example. There's entire rivers that have been daylighted from underneath former freeways in Korea. There's cities in India where protected areas include tigers. There's, within urban areas, there's just, a lot of different things going on in different parts of the world. Still, though, I would have to say, I guess a place that I'm familiar with, obviously, is Vancouver, and there's been a lot of interesting things go on here. There's restoration of herring is one that I have found really interesting. People have reseeded, including, the Indigenous nations in the Vancouver area have been involved in bringing herring roe back into False Creek, which is a harbor that reaches right into downtown Vancouver. And there was all kinds of uncertainty about whether it would take hold there, but it did. I mean, there's a completely artificial island that has gets coated with herring roe now, and there's some belief that this isn't clear whether this is true or not, but there's some belief that whales have started revisiting Vancouver Harbor more because of the presence of herring, and the presence of those herring might be related is related, at least in part, to the creation of an artificial island where turns out they like to lay roe. So there's a lot of great possibilities.
Now, kind of touching on that a bit with some of the work that the Indigenous nations are doing. At the beginning, you said that we can't know what to do next without knowing what used to be here. And of course, our Indigenous people are huge holders of that knowledge. How can we better listen to and engage with the Indigenous who might have more understanding of what used to be here and how to bring it back to what it could be?
Well, I think we need to be talking to Indigenous people about this question. We need to be fully involving them, and I think my opinion is that we need to be sorting out questions of land title and sovereignty, because one thing we might be able to do is simply grant them more power to make choices on landscapes that are theirs. It's certainly been an important part of bison restoration. It's been a really important part of salmon restoration projects and herring restoration projects in BC. I think there's countless others. There's emerging research. There's a book produced recently by a friend of mine, Alejandro Fried, who has finally, there are academics out looking at the question of what kinds of conservation practices did Indigenous nations use, and it's pretty clear now that there were a lot of. It wasn't simply a matter of some kind of cultural bond with nature, although of course that's part of it. There were active application of conservation practices to try to sustain, maintain, and restore wild species on the landscape.
A somewhat bizarre rewilding project is I'm going to say this wrong, Pleistocene? Oh, yeah. Project in Siberia to recreate the grassland steppe that existed during the time of the mammoths. Is this rewilding a step too far?
I mean, I'm going to say no, because probably mostly because my first piece of published writing was a letter I wrote to Owl magazine in support of mammoth cloning and rewilding when I was like 8 years old or something. But I don't know, it captures the imagination. It's obviously something that you'd want to do with carefully and with plenty of controls in place. But I think, I suppose I'm interested in projects like that because they open our imaginations to what might be possible. On the other hand, there are some very realistic Pleistocene rewilding type projects. I wrote about one a number of years ago for the Walrus magazine about a species called the Bolson Tortoise, which had not been known to have existed in the southwestern United States since, before before settlement by European and by non-Indigenous people. So because that was the case, because of the fact that when the first white explorers and settlers were coming out across portions of the United States, they never encountered the Bolson tortoise. It wasn't considered a species to be protected or restored within the United States. But people took a look at that and said, well, really the only reason that the Bolson tortoise might ever have left the United States is perhaps it was overhunted in pre-colonial times. It has legitimate potential to be part of the fauna. And there are Bolson tortoises now, rewilded into the southern United States. So there's possibilities for Pleistocene rewilding that aren't quite as astonishing as a mammoth or restoring lions or cheetahs to the Great Plains. But it's, as I say, it's something that opens up the imagination.
Rewilding versus permaculture versus modern homesteading, are they all feasible in moderation, or is there a clear winner or loser? And that's a question from Rory, who's watching on Facebook.
I'm not sure I entirely understand the question in this case, but I would say that, permacultural practices and modern homesteading practices can be more or less rewilding projects as well. So permaculture projects can certainly involve rewilding if they're focused on impacts on native landscapes and reflect in some way native environments. Modern homesteading, this question of, I once had the good fortune to have lunch with the nature writer David Quammen and asked him, what his key advice is for people who want to lower their environmental impact. And he said, don't build a second home in the country, which of course is many Canadians' dream. And I found that a really interesting response, because I thought, well, there's a lot to that, spreading our impact far and wide through, the ownership not only of an urban space, but the use and ownership of a rural space is, it does create problems of expanding human presence and impact. At the same time, I think that there might be great opportunities for, learning better how to live on the landscape, in our cabins, in our, the places that we go to get away from our urban lives. And there's so much value for us in terms of rewilding, ourselves from spending time out in the wild. So I think there's a lot of possibility in exploring how to deepen our experience in things like spending time in cabins, spending that traditional Canadian time in the cabin in the woods.
Another question here from Jan on Facebook. So you mentioned that we need to build strong social relationships to the natural world. How do we build these relationships? And then how do we deepen any relationships that might already exist?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I mean,
Tough ones.
yeah, these are real, these are really cracking me here. The
Looks like James is just frozen here for a second. Give us one moment. I'm sure all of you have frozen on a Zoom call at some point in the last year. Bear with us for a moment here. We'll be right back. Hi there, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm so sorry. I've just heard from James, and unfortunately, his power has gone out. So if you're watching from Vancouver, maybe your power is out too, and you're just lucky enough to have a little bit stronger internet. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. If James was here, he would be sure to tell you about his newest book, which comes out in May. It's called The Day the World Stopped Shopping. We'll put the link on how to pre-order that book in the comments wherever you're watching. Please consider joining us on April 1st for a panel discussion on women in the environmental sciences, featuring Megan Leslie, Alexandra Morton, and Ingrid Waldron. In the meantime, for all of your wildlife, nature, and science news, consider subscribing to Canadian Geographic Magazine at cangeo.ca/subscribe. And we're also on Apple News now, so you can check us out on there as well. Again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're so sorry about these technical problems. If we can get James to answer any questions in the future, we will definitely come back and do so. And feel free to email us and we'll pass those on to him. Have a great night, everybody.